The great bells of Valoria rang across the sunrise. They rolled through clear air and echoed off every shining tower and bridge. Queen Alara stood at the highest balcony of the royal hall, dressed not in heavy jewels, but in a simple white gown. The morning light touched her hair, and she felt the weight of both crown and hope on her shoulders. Today was her wedding day. The streets below were full of voices. Everywhere banners waved, carrying the gold and blue crest of the kingdom. Farmers had come from distant valleys, merchants left their stalls, and even children pressed forward to see the queen who had chosen a husband unlike any before. The talk in every home and tavern was the same. Why would a queen marry a common man, a blacksmith from the lower town? Andrew Hale was no nobleman. His small forge sat near the river, and his hands were marked with the lines of labor. He was strong and quiet, his eyes the color of worn steel, his manner humble and steady. When the word of the royal choice spread, many in the court whispered that the queen had lost her sense. The advisers talked through endless nights, warning her that she risked the respect of the nobles and the safety of her rule. But Alara had already decided. She had met Andrew months earlier, when she visited the lower town after a storm had broken the city's western bridge. While most men bowed and waited for her soldiers to give orders, Andrew had simply taken his hammer and begun to work. He gave no speeches, asked no favors, and when mud soaked his clothes, he only smiled and said, "The bridge will stand again." That quiet certainty had stayed with her. Later she returned to the forge, at first out of curiosity, then out of something far deeper and warmer. They spoke often as he worked, her questions gentle, his answers short but thoughtful. He never flattered her, and that alone made him a mystery in the palace world. One evening, as the sun fell behind the hills, she realized that in his presence, she no longer felt like a queen. She felt simply human. Now, as the bells continued, Lara stepped back from the balcony and turned toward the small hall where the wedding guests waited. The nobles stood stiffly in their bright clothes. Some bowed too deeply, some not at all. Her trusted friend and advisor, Lady Marin, met her eyes and offered a soft smile of support. Ilara felt her heart calm a little and nodded in return. Through the tall doors, the man she was to marry stepped inside. Andrew wore plain clothes of dark blue cloth and a narrow belt of silver. The courtiers stared in disbelief that this simple man had not chosen armor or gold. He looked straight at the queen with the same open expression he always had, neither nervous nor proud. The old priest of Valoria raised his hands. The voices around the hall faded until only the echo of the bells could be heard through the stone walls. The vows were spoken slowly, each word resting with care on the air. When Andrew took the queen's hand, some of the nobles gasped quietly, as though their world had slipped from its proper shape. Ilara's heart beat fast when she said the words that bound her to him. For a moment the sound of the court disappeared. She saw only the warmth in Andrew's eyes, and felt something she had never found in the palace or the council chamber piece.
Outside.
The crowd cheered as they stepped onto the balcony together. The sunlight shone against the new gold rings on their hands. Andrew lifted his head and smiled to the people, and that smile was simple but strong, like the man himself. Some of the courtiers behind them forced polite applause, while others remained silent, their faces unreadable.
"Ain't dead yet."
Yet the people below shouted with joy. To them, a queen of noble birth had reached down to love a man of the common road. It was a story worth believing in. As the day grew long, the feast began. Minstrels sang in the courtyards, and laughter spread through the open halls. But beneath the surface of celebration, the old tension of the court lingered. In low voices, some nobles muttered that this marriage would ruin the throne, that no kingdom could stand with a blacksmith as king. Others, quieter still, admitted that perhaps the queen saw something hidden that they could not. While the candles flickered and the sky turned violet, Ilara and Andrew walked together in the royal gardens. The distant sounds of the feast faded behind them. The queen looked at the man beside her and wondered what unseen paths this choice would open. Andrew spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. "The world changes faster than we think," he said, touching the old stone wall that bordered the path. "What is built in pride falls, but what is built in care lasts." Ilara felt a strange calm again. Her heart told her that her kingdom had not been weakened by this union, but strengthened in a new and quiet way. She could not explain it, yet she trusted it more than all the council of her nobles. As night settled, the torches along the walls glowed like stars. The bells of Valoria gave one last echo, soft and deep across the valley. The queen and the blacksmith king stood side by side, their hands clasped, unaware that this quiet moment would soon be the beginning of deeds that would shake the world. The moon had barely faded when messengers began to arrive at the castle gates. They came on dusty horses, breathless and shaken. Each carried the same warning. Strange riders had crossed the borders of Valoria. Villages had been burned, crops stolen, and the people driven from their homes. The peace that had followed the royal wedding was breaking like glass. Queen Alara listened to the reports in the dawn light of the council hall. Her eyes were tired but calm. Around her stood the nobles and generals arguing among themselves. Lord Daron, an older man with silver hair and a voice like thunder, struck his hand on the table. "The queen should send the royal army at once," he said. "We cannot let these invaders reach the capital." Another noble, thin and sharp-eyed, shook his head. "The northern wall is weak. The northern wall is weak. We attack now and we risk losing everything." Alara sat quietly as the men spoke over one another, their pride heavier than their wisdom. Her gaze turned to Andrew, who stood near the edge of the room. He wore no crown today, only a simple coat, and said nothing. Many of the nobles ignored him completely, though they could not ignore that the queen's eyes often found him first. When the voices around the table rose too high, Alara lifted her hand. The hall fell silent. "We will defend our people," she said. "We will not act in anger. Our kingdom has seen too much blood. We must think before we strike." Lord Daron frowned. "My queen, with all respect, we do not have time for caution. These enemies show no mercy." Andrew spoke for the first time, his voice low but clear. "I will go with a group of soldiers to see the truth myself. If the danger is close, I will send word." The council turned to stare at him, and a few laughed softly in disbelief. "A blacksmith leads soldiers now," one whispered. Alara met Andrew's eyes. "You would do this for Valoria?" He nodded. "The forge has taught me patience, but also when to strike. Let me see what we face before we burn bridges that cannot be rebuilt." Some of the nobles protested, yet the queen's decision was final. Andrew was given command of a small group of knights and scouts. At sunrise the next day, they rode out through the gates, their armor catching the light like ripples on water. The road north wound through green fields that slowly turned dry and gray. Smoke rose in the distance, thin trails against the bright sky. Andrew rode in silence, his mind steady, his eyes sharp. He noticed the small signs others missed, the tracks of heavy boots, the broken branches that showed how fast the enemy had moved. By evening, they reached a burned village. The homes were in ruins, but the people who had fled were safe, hiding in the forest nearby. Andrew spoke with the frightened farmers, asking what they had seen. They told him of men in black cloaks, carrying strange, heavy weapons that crackled like thunder. Their leader rode a horse covered in armor and spoke of taking the capital within days. Andrew listened carefully to every word, his thoughts already turning toward the path ahead. He sent a young messenger back to the city with a letter for the queen. It told her of the danger and urged her to prepare, but also warned that this enemy might not fight like others before. That night, under the pale stars, Andrew and his men made camp near the river. The firelight flickered across their faces. One of the soldiers, a tall man named Simon, looked at Andrew with deep respect. "You keep calm even now," he said. "How do you do it?" Andrew looked into the flames. "A man cannot shape iron if his hands shake. Keep the fire under control, or it burns your work to ash. War is the same." The next morning, they rode closer to the border. Near the cliffs of Arden Pass, they found the enemy's camp at last. Tents filled the valley below, and at least 1,000 men moved among them. Andrew studied the sight in silence. "We cannot fight them head-on," he said. "But the pass is narrow. If we control it, they cannot move freely." The knights looked uncertain, but Andrew already had a plan. He sent half his men into the hills to gather stones and timber. The rest worked to build traps and block the paths that led deeper into Valoria. By the time the sun touched the mountains, their work was nearly complete. When the enemy scouts came that night, they found the narrow pass dark and quiet. They moved carefully, not knowing that Andrew and his men waited above them in the cliffs. At the perfect moment, he gave the signal. Stones rained down, breaking the enemy's line. The soldiers of Valoria shouted and charged, their cries carrying through the cold air. The battle was short but fierce. Andrew fought with the same calm focus he showed at the forge. Every movement measured, every strike true. When dawn came, the pass was secure. The rest of the invaders fell back, leaving their dead behind. Andrew stood at the ridge, sweating and bruised, and looked toward the south where the city lay. "This was only their first test," he said quietly. "They will return stronger." He turned to his men, his face set with purpose. "We ride home. The Queen must know everything." As the morning wind swept through the valley, the men of Valoria followed their blacksmith king back toward the rising sun, unaware that their small victory was just the beginning of a far greater storm. The riders entered the city gates at dusk. Dust clung to their cloaks, and their horses stumbled with weariness. Andrew dismounted first and handed his reins to a guard. The people who saw him pass through the streets whispered among themselves, surprised that the king himself had been to the war front. Some bowed, others only stared. They saw a man who looked more like a worker than a ruler, but there was something in his eyes that no crown could give. Inside the palace, Queen Alara waited beside the tall windows of the council room. When Andrew stepped inside, she stood and crossed the floor quickly. For a moment, formality faded, and her face showed more relief than pride. "You are safe," she said, her voice soft but full of weight. "I feared I had sent you into danger too soon." "There is danger, yes," Andrew said, resting one tired hand on the table. "But now we know what kind. The enemy is larger than we thought. Their tools are strange, their strength fierce, yet they can still be beaten." The generals leaned in around the table as he explained what he had seen: their hidden camps, their weapons that spat fire, their leader who spoke of conquest as if it were already done. Lord Duran frowned and crossed his arms. "So we wait for them to strike?" he said sharply. "True king would march upon them now." Andrew met his gaze without anger. "True king protects before he proves. If we run to fight on their terms, we lose before the first blade falls." The room grew silent. Ilara watched him quietly. She noticed, again, how his calm presence steadied the room far better than any speech. In the days that followed, Andrew stayed near the forges, called for every blacksmith in Valoria to gather within the castle grounds. The forges blazed through the night as sparks flew high into the air. People from the city lined the outer walls to watch. They had never seen the king at work with his sleeves rolled and his hands blackened with soot. He spoke very little as he worked, yet his actions guided others. He showed the smiths new ways to shape the metal, how to balance the weight of a sword so that even a young soldier could wield it swiftly. More curious still, the weapons he touched seemed stronger than before, their steel brighter, their edges flawless. No one could explain it, not even the older craftsmen, but none dared question it. When Alara came to him one evening, she found him standing by the glowing coals. The red light shone on his face. "You could have left this work to others," she said. He shook his head. "The tools of war should not be built by fear alone. Each piece forged here is a promise to our people. It must be shaped by a steady hand." She watched him for a long moment, feeling both admiration and a small unease she could not name. There was something about Andrew when he stood by the fire of strength that felt larger than any man. The forge's light reflected in his eyes like the heart of the sun. In the following weeks, the city changed. Barricades rose along the gates. Scouts moved out every dawn and returned with news by nightfall. The queen held meetings with her council every morning, and Andrew was always beside her. His advice was clear and calm, never rushed, but never uncertain. People began calling him the Iron Heart behind closed doors, though he never heard it himself. One gray morning, a scout brought a new warning. The enemy army was moving again, faster this time, their banners spotted only 2 days' ride from the capital. Fear rippled through the council room. Some nobles argued again for surrender. Others demanded battle at once. Ilara turned to Andrew. His hands rested on the edge of the table, fingers steady. "What would you have us do?" she asked. He looked around the room before turning his eyes back to her. "We will not hide behind walls," he said. "But we will not rush to meet them either. The hills near the river form a natural barrier. We will gather there. I will build weapons for defense strong enough to hold until they tire." The generals obeyed, though their eyes carried doubt. Soldiers began moving toward the river cliffs the next day, and the air filled with the clang of hammers and the creak of wagons. At night, Andrew walked alone along the empty courtyard. He looked up at the sky, filled with quiet stars. He thought of the faces of the people depending on him, the workers, the soldiers, the queen who had trusted him when no one else had. His jaw set hard, and he whispered to the silence, "I will not fail them." A faint wind stirred, carrying the scent of iron and burning oil from the forges. Somewhere beyond the walls, the enemy moved closer, their torches flickering in the dark. But inside the city, hope began to take shape just as strong as the steel Andrew forged. When the first thunder of marching feet was heard the following dawn, Andrew was ready. The soldiers looked to him, their fear lessened by the calm in his voice. The queen stood beside him, dressed in plain armor, her eyes shining with both worry and trust. The enemy had come to crush the heart of Valoria, but what waited for them was no longer only a queen's army. It was a kingdom bound together by courage and by the steady strength of a man who had once been only a blacksmith. As the horns sounded across the fields, Andrew raised his hand. His hammer caught the sunlight like a promise. The Battle of Valoria had begun, and the man the world had called common was about to show them who he truly was. The morning sky was the color of dull silver as the army of Valoria prepared for battle. The mist moved like smoke through the hills, hiding both friend and enemy. All around, the sound of shields, horses, and hurried footsteps filled the air. The people of the city waited behind the high walls, praying that the day would not end in ruin. Andrew stood on the ridge that overlooked the wide plain below. His armor was plain but strong, and his hammer hung at his side, a heavy reminder of what he once was. His eyes were calm, though every man around him could feel the weight of the coming fight. Queen Alara stood a few steps behind, her face pale but steady. At the first light, horns echoed across the valley. The enemy came like a dark flood, banners whipping in the wind. Thousands of soldiers marched in tight lines, their iron armor shining in the pale sun. Behind them, great engines rolled forward, built to break walls and hearts alike.
Ow.
The generals on the hill grew uneasy. Even the bravest among them swallowed hard. One leaned close to Andrew and whispered, "We are outnumbered 3 times over. Cannot hold this place." Andrew did not look away from the valley when he answered. "We will hold," he said simply, "'cause we must." The horns of Valoria sounded in reply. Arrows flew through the mist, sharp and fast. The first wave of the enemy broke against the hidden traps Andrew had built weeks before. Pits opened suddenly. Lines of wooden spikes tore through their ranks, and many fell before they even reached the foot of the hill. But still they came, climbing over their fallen comrades, shouting in rage. Soon the clash of steel filled the air. The soldiers of Valoria fought hard, every strike pushing back despair. Andrew moved among them, shouting words of courage. Where the line weakened, he was there. Where fear sparked, his voice calmed it. The battle raged for hours. The ground was thick with mud and smoke. The enemy pushed harder, using great hammers to break the barriers. When one of the huge engines reached the hill, Andrew ran forward, unarmed except for the hammer he had forged himself. He swung it once, and the engine cracked apart as though struck by lightning. Soldiers froze in shock. None had ever seen such a thing before. Queen Alara, watching from the rear, felt her heart leap. She had seen him work miracles at the forge, shaping metal like clay. But this was something greater. The power that lived inside her husband was not born of human strength alone. She could feel it in every strike he made. The enemy army began to falter. Their leader, a tall man in dark iron, rode forward, shouting commands to rally them. Andrew turned toward him and stepped into the open space between the two armies. The man on horseback called down, "You think one blacksmith can stand against an army?" Andrew's voice was calm, but filled the valley. "I am not standing against an army. I am standing for a people." The rider laughed and pulled his sword free. He charged, his horse tearing the ground. Andrew did not move until the last moment. Then he raised his hammer. When metal met metal, a sound like thunder rolled through the plain. The rider's sword shattered, and he was thrown to the ground. The troops nearest him stumbled back in fear. For a heartbeat, the world seemed still. The mist parted, and the sun shone fully for the first time that day, falling on Andrew's figure like a crown of fire. Then he raised the hammer again, and his voice rang out across the field. For Valoria, for every home behind these hills. The soldiers of Valoria answered with a roar. They drove forward, their courage renewed. The enemy broke under the strength of their will. Some fled, others threw down their weapons. The plain that had begun the day as a place of fear now became the ground of victory. When the last echo of battle ended, silence fell. Only the breeze moved through the grass. Andrew stood among the fallen, his chest rising with slow breaths. Round him men knelt, some in prayer, some in disbelief. Queen Alara came down from the hill and walked through the lines until she reached him. Her eyes filled with tears that she did not hide. "You have saved us," she said. Andrew shook his head. "We saved ourselves. The heart of Valoria has always been strong. It only needed to remember." As the sun dipped behind the hills, the surviving soldiers began to sing softly, an old song of peace. The air carried their voices across the open land. The queen and the blacksmith king stood together, the light around them warm and golden. The people who watched from the city walls saw the signal rise one bright flame that meant victory. They shouted and wept, calling out their rulers' names. For them, this day would be told and retold for generations. Yet for Andrew, it was not pride he felt, but quiet purpose. He looked toward the horizon where the enemy had fled, and said in a low voice, "Peace must be guarded as carefully as iron in the forge. It can break if we strike it without care." Alara placed her hand on his arm, and together they walked back toward the hill, leaving behind the broken weapons and the hush of a battle that had tested more than courage. It had revealed the true heart of a man once believed to be ordinary. The weeks after the battle passed slowly, like ripples spreading across a quiet pond. The city of Valoria, once full of worry, now moved with new life. Farmers returned to their fields, children played in the streets again, and the sound of hammers came from every forge. The fear that had once shadowed every face was fading. Queen Alara spent her mornings walking among her people. She listened as they spoke about rebuilding their homes, and she smiled when they told her how the blacksmith king had changed their hearts. To them, Andrew was no longer just a ruler. He was a symbol of courage, born not from power, but from goodness. Inside the palace, Andrew returned to quiet work. He spent long hours in the forges below the castle, shaping tools for rebuilding rather than weapons for war. When the soldiers who had fought beside him came to visit, he greeted each of them warmly, remembering all their names. It seemed no task was too small for him. Even as king, he still valued simple work done with care. Alara sometimes watched him through the glow of the forge. She saw the same calm strength that had first drawn her to him, but also a deep wariness in his eyes. One evening, she asked, "Do you regret fighting them?" Andrew wiped the soot from his hands and shook his head.
Oh.
"But war leaves more than wounds on the body. It burns through the soul. Peace must be built one kindness at a time, not with swords." His words stayed in her mind long after he had left the forge. As seasons changed, Valoria began to heal. Still whispers spread from the borders of the kingdom. Some said the defeated enemy gathered strength again in distant lands. Others said broken soldiers roamed as bandits in the hills. Andrew received every report quietly, then sent aid and patrols, always careful never to rule through fear. One night, a messenger arrived at the palace, pale and trembling. He told of a new threat, a storm, not of men, but of nature. Heavy rains had fallen in the northern valleys, and the great river was rising fast. Villages there were in danger of flood. Without waiting for counsel, Andrew called for horses and supplies. Lara tried to stop him. "You have already given enough," she said. "Let the generals handle it." He took her hand gently. A king who does not stand beside his people in peace is no different from one who hides behind them in war. "I must go." He left before sunrise, riding at the head of a small group of workers and guards. The journey took 2 days through mud and wind. When they reached the valley, the river was already roaring, tearing at its banks. Families fled to higher ground, clutching what little they could carry. Andrew gave orders quickly, his voice clear even through the storm. "We will build barriers here and here," he said, pointing to the weakest edges of the river. He grabbed a shovel himself, working shoulder to shoulder with the villagers. The rain soaked him through, but he did not stop. The sight of their king working beside them gave strength to all. For 3 days and nights they fought the storm together. The river raged, but the barriers held. When at last the rain eased and the water began to fall, the people cheered. Not one village had been lost. Andrew stood by the riverbank, his clothes heavy with mud, watching the sun rise through the gray clouds. He smiled faintly and said, "This is what power is for, not for glory, but for keeping others safe." When he returned to the capital, the city welcomed him as a hero again, though he seemed almost shy at the celebrations. He walked beside Alara through the streets as flower petals fell from the windows. In his eyes there was pride, but also humility. That night, as the torches burned low in the palace, Ilara and Andrew sat on the balcony overlooking the valley. The stars shone bright and steady. She leaned her head gently on his shoulder. "We have seen darkness," she whispered, "but you brought us back into the light." He smiled. "We brought ourselves back. One person alone can never lift a kingdom. It takes many hearts, each one trying their best." Years later, the two of them had grown older. Their story was still told by travelers and singers. Children in villages learned of the blacksmith who became a king, the man who turned iron into hope and power into peace. Andrew and Alara ruled with fairness until their final days. Under their care, Valoria became a land where strength was measured not by how high one stood, but by how many one could lift. In every forge and workshop, a piece of the old legend lived on. The hammers rang not for war, but for creation. And long after both ruler and queen had passed, the people of Valoria still told the story of the day. Their humble blacksmith revealed his true strength. It's not by destroying his enemies, but by building a world strong enough to live without fear.